The Middle East holds almost half of the world's proven oil reserves, despite only covering a few percent of the global land area. Why does the Middle East have so much oil? To answer this question, we need to look at how crude oil is formed. Crude oil is formed from the remains of billions of tiny marine organisms. When they died, their remains sank and were buried in mud and sand, often in places with little oxygen. This made it so that they didn't fully decay. Over time, more layers of mud and sand fall on top of these dead microorganisms, and the layers slowly pile up over millions of years. The weight of the new layers presses down on the lower layers, which makes the mud and sand harden and turn into rock. The pressure from the overlying rock and the heat from the earth, due to the remains being buried deep underground, gradually transform the preserved organic material first into a waxy material called kerogen, and then eventually into crude oil. But if crude oil is formed by the remains of microorganisms in the ocean, why is there so much of it in the Middle East? After all, the Middle East is dry, and there are surely other places that are much more suitable for life. Yes, but we do have to realize that it takes a really long time for crude oil to form, and many millions of years ago, what is now the Middle East was covered by a warm shallow sea known as the Tethys Ocean. This climate was perfect for tiny organisms like plankton and algae, but having these microorganisms is not enough on its own. Other places might also have had plenty of tiny marine organisms, but they often didn't have the right types of rocks to create and preserve giant reservoirs of oil like the Middle East did. The crude oil naturally wants to move upwards because it's lighter than the underground water around it. The geology of the Middle East has many porous rocks, which are like sponges with lots of tiny holes where the crude oil can be. You can think of the crude oil stored in the pores of the rock like water inside a sponge. These pores also act as natural pathways for the crude oil. But the Middle East also has layers of rocks that are impermeable, in other words, that are tight and sealed. These act like a lid, keeping the oil trapped. And when a tight and sealed layer of rock is above a porous layer of rock, it creates a large reservoir of crude oil that can be extracted by humans. The Middle East also benefited from its land not moving around much. In places with lots of earthquakes or volcanoes, the oil can escape or get destroyed by heat and pressure. But the Arabian Plate has been relatively calm for hundreds of millions of years. This stability allowed oil to remain safely trapped instead of escaping or being destroyed. So in conclusion, the Middle East has so much oil because it had the perfect mix of ingredients. An ancient sea containing billions of tiny organisms whose remains became the crude oil, the right kinds of rocks to store and trap the oil, and stable land that kept the oil safe underground for millions of years.